Welcome. Come on in to Sunday School Teachings. My name is Imelda Trevino Ingman, and I am the Youth Minister at Creative Worship Center, also known as CWC, a global ministry based out of Redford, Michigan. Our senior pastor is Reverend Dr. Cecilia Greenbar. The second book of Samuel is the 10th book of the Bible and has 24 chapters. At one time, 1st and 2nd Samuel were one book. 2nd Samuel starts with David 7 years as king living in Hebron and finishes with the end of his life, having served as king from the age of 30 to 70. Let's journey together. The purpose of 2 Samuel is to record the history of David's reign, to demonstrate effective leadership under God's command, to reveal that one man can in fact make a difference. Thus, David is a key figure in God's kingdom agenda, not only for Israel, but for the whole world. Now, as we take a look at this chapter summaries, we're going to look at them in 5 sections. The first section is the coronation and conflicts of David. The second is Jerusalem being conquered, the covenant with the Lord, and the military victories. Followed by David's sin and its consequences, a son's rebellion and its consequences, and his final years as king. So the first section, in this first chapter, it is reported by an Amalekite that King Saul was dead. He states that Saul had begged him to kill him because he was mortally wounded and did not want to be taken by the enemy and suffer at their hands. But by his own admission, whether true or not, the man killed the Lord's anointed. Even David, who had been haunted by Saul, had chosen to leave him in God's hands. This Amalekite should have done the same. David judged the man by his own testimony and killed him. David mourned the death of Saul and Saul's son, Jonathan. After a period of mourning, David asked God if he should go to Judah, and God told him to go to Hebron instead. After a while, the man came to David and made him king of Judah. But he was not yet king over all Israel, a fact serving as an early indication of the coming division between the north territories that would one day become Israel and the southern territories that would be called Judah. Then the extent of the division between the north and the south became evident when Abner, the commander of Saul, appointed Saul's son. The rebellion against David led to civil war for 2 years. Let's take a look at the next section. The conquering of Jerusalem. The promise God made to David and the military victory. When the tribes of Israel approached David and mentioned that Saul was once their king and now he was gone and they were looking for leadership, they told David, as a former great leader, he must assume the role of becoming their king. So at the age of 30, David was anointed the king of Israel. He had ruled for 40 years. David conquers Jerusalem. The Jebusites controlled Jerusalem, and David just marched in with his army upon them and conquered the city and built a fortress in it, which became known as the city of David. David bore many children with his wives. The wives he took, so his lineage would grow. David also conquered the Philistines. As Jerusalem became the political capital, David decided to move the ark to Jerusalem and make it the religious capital. So David collected 30,000 men of the able-bodied men of Jerusalem and instructed them to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city. When the Ark was set on a cart and was pulled by oxen, 2 men were guiding the cart, Uzzah and Ahio. When the oxen fell, Uzzah put his hand on the ark, and this immediately angered the Lord. And Uzzah was killed when he was struck by the anger of the Lord. David was angry at what had happened, and he named the area of the incident after Uzzah. David was in fear of the Lord after this occurred. He wondered if it was wise to bring the relic to the city. So he stored it at Obed-Edom at his home, and it remained at his home for 3 months. Obed-Edom was blessed during this time period. When David learned of Obed-Edom and his house being blessed for storing the ark, he rejoiced and called for it to be brought to him. Many burnt offerings were made to ensure the Lord would be honored appropriately, and a great deal of celebration occurred as the ark was brought into the city. At this point, David, firmly established as the king of Israel and his enemies being defeated, he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Zion, also called the City of David, after a long exile. However, David was uneasy living in a cedar palace, while the Ark of God was housed in a mere tent. But David asked if he could build him a temple, but the Lord's response was essential. Simply, thanks, but no thanks. Far from needing provisions, God had always been the provider. It was David's descendant who would build a house, a temple for the name of the Lord. Faithful love would never depart from him. Thus the house and the kingdom and throne of David would be established forever. Here is the covenant that God promised David, that from his royal blood there would be a king that would be tied to the promise he had made to Abraham, and that this is how he would bring blessings to all nations. But in the midst of all this wonderful blessings, David sins and their consequences. But during all this blessing, in the spring, at a time when most kings head off to war, King David told Joab to go to battle with his men, as well as the entire army of Israel. He wiped out the Ammonites. One evening, when David was walking on the roof of his palace, he noticed a beautiful woman bathing. He sent a man out to learn more about her. When he returned, he told David that the woman was named Bathsheba. She was a wife of Uriah. David sent some messengers to bring her to him. So she went to David and slept with him. Then Bathsheba returned home. Then later she sent word to the king that she was pregnant. So David sent for Uriah. He was a Hittite. When he arrived, the king asked him how the war was going, and then told him to go home and be with his family. Uriah left but did not go home. Instead, he slept at the palace entrance. When David found out, he asked him why he had not gone home. Uriah told him that if Judah, Israel, and the ark were staying in tents, then he could not go home to eat or sleep and be with his wife. David gave Uriah a letter that he told him that he had written himself, and told him to give it to Joab. In the letter, David told Joab to put Uriah in the very front of the fierce fighting and then pull away from him so that Uriah would be killed. Joab did this, and Uriah died in battle. Joab sent a messenger to tell David that Uriah was dead. When Bathsheba learned that her husband had died, she mourned him. When the mourning period was over, King David and Bathsheba, he brought her to him. She married David and had his son. But when King David had accomplished what he had accomplished displeased God. So God sent Nathan the prophet to see David. Nathan told him a parable. In the parable, one man was very rich and had much stock, while a poor man only had a ewe, which he treated like one of his own children. But when the traveler came to stay with the rich man, he refused to take one of the sheep or one of his cows to feed him, but took the poor man's ewe instead. When David hears this story, he was full with righteous anger, not realizing that it applied to him. Nathan then reveals that the story is about him. He reminds David that the Lord made him king. He kept Saul, the old king, from killing him. And now David has Saul's house, his wives, his kingdom, and the Lord would have given him even more than this, but he sins. Nathan reminds David that he's not going to die, but he did kill an innocent person. And for that, his house would always be in turmoil. David quickly repented, and Nathan told him that his son born to him and Bathsheba would die because of David's sin. And sure enough, the child gets sick and dies despite David's pleading and fasting. After this, David and Bathsheba have another child whom they named Solomon. God loves this child and tells Nathan to have the child named Jedediah, which means the beloved of the Lord. But the trouble is just beginning for David, because David's son Amnon fell in love with his sister Tamar, who is a virgin. One day, pretending to be ill, he had his sister bake some bread for him. And when she tried to feed it to him, he grabbed her and he took her and pulled her into bed. He violated Tamar. Tamar told her brother Absalom, and she and Absalom asked her not to tell anyone. And she went to live at Absalom's home. A few years later, though, Absalom commanded his man to strike down his brother when he was full of wine, and that they should not be afraid to do this because it was an order. To escape punishment, Absalom went to the home of his maternal grandfather, where he stayed for 3 years. David wanted Absalom back, but he could not just send for him and pretend everything was fine. Finally, Joab, David's army commander, came up with a reunion plan and persuaded a wise woman from Tekoa, located about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, to carry out this plan. Her words were a trick to show David that while he was willing to grant clemency to so many unnamed murderers, he had not granted it for his own son. David gave Joab permission to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem, but only under one condition: that he could not see David. So we move on to the next section: a son's rebellion and its consequences. Absalom, still disgruntled and knew exactly how he would plot to take his father's throne. He did not need an army. He had charm, he was shrewd, and for 4 years he was conniving. Absalom had himself proclaimed king. The revolt was in full swing. The word of the revolt reached David, and instantly David ordered an evacuation of his entire household from Jerusalem to avoid the bloodshed and spare Jerusalem from certain destruction. David intended to lead his men into battle against Absalom, but his followers knew this would not be an easy battle for David, because it would pit him against his own son. After great deliberation, David decided to heed the advice of the men and stay back. They defeated Absalom, which grieved David. The final chapter. This section reveals David's relationship with the Gibeonites. Now, this particular section is a whole bunch of random stories, but we learn about his relationship with the Gibeonites, and how he seeks to make amends after Saul tried to destroy him. Then it shifts to David recounting how the Lord rescued him from so many enemies, including King Saul, who tried to kill him more than once. He writes a song of praise. David calls God his deliverer, his fortress, his rock in which he takes refuge. This is David's song of praise. David's last words were about how the Spirit of God spoke through him and how if his house was not right with the Lord, then he would not receive salvation. The words of the song also describe that evil men should be cast aside. It tells the story of David's senses angering the Lord. God was angry with Israel because they had sinned in so many different ways. So he allowed Satan to tempt David to arrogantly count the size of his troops. But that angered the Lord, and he gave David 3 options. But David told the Lord, I'll take your decision, Lord. And the Lord decided to send a plague to Israel that very morning, and 70,000 died in 3 days. David pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his people. He recognized that the sin was his and begged God to let judgment be against his family only. Now, there are several key themes in 2 Samuel. First, kingdom growth. Under David's leadership, David's kingdom grew rapidly. While the growth came with many changes, from tribal independence to centralized government, from leadership of judges to the monarchy, from decentralized worship to centralized worship. Personal greatness, David's popularity, influence increased greatly. He realized that the Lord was behind his success because he wanted to pour out his kindness on Israel. David regarded God's interest as more important than his own. God graciously poured out his favor on us because of what Christ has done. Justice. King David showed justice, mercy, and fairness to Saul's family, enemy, rebels, allies, and close friends alike. His just rule was grounded in his faith and knowledge of God. Consequences. David abandoned his purpose as a leader and king in a time of war. His desire for prosperity and ease led him from triumph to trouble. And sin. David not only sinned with Bathsheba, but also murdered an innocent man. He also neglected to discipline his one son, that when he got involved in rape and murder. This great hero showed a lack of character in some of his most important personal decisions. The man of iron had feet of clay. As you read the second book of Samuel, look for David's godly characters, his faithfulness, patience, courage, generosity, commitment, and honesty, as well as other God-honoring characteristics. Here is the breakdown. I invite you to read the classical stories. There's one about the ark being brought into Jerusalem. I found it very fascinating. I invite you to read it jointly. One of the popular verses is 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 3. So David and his wives and his men and their families all moved to Judah, and they settled in the villages near Hebron. Thank you for journeying through the second book of Samuel.